The morning sun streamed through the massive windows of JFK International Airport, casting long shadows across the polished floors. It was barely 7 a.m., and the terminal was already buzzing with its usual morning rush. Business travelers clutching coffee cups, families carolling excited children, and airline staff moving purposefully through the crowds. Among this sea of travelers walked David and Amanda Thompson, though you wouldn't guess they were any different from the hundreds of other passengers that morning. Amanda's dark hair was pulled back in a messy bun, and she wore simple black yoga pants paired with an old Harvard sweatshirt that had seen better days. The sweatshirt was a comfort reminder of her graduate school years, before she and David had built their investment firm from the ground up. David walked beside her, pushing their luggage cart with one hand while the other held his phone. He wore faded jeans and a navy blue quarter-zip fleece, his go-to travel outfit. His forehead creased slightly as he read another message from their pilot, Jim. "Looks like they found something during the routine check," he murmured to Amanda, showing her the message. "Nothing serious, but they want to double-check the navigation system. We'll need to go through the main terminal to reach the private aviation wing." Amanda nodded, adjusting the strap of her carry-on bag. "That's fine. We're early anyway, and I could use a proper coffee." She smiled at her husband, the kind of warm, knowing smile that comes from years of facing life's little hiccups together. They made their way past the airline check-in counters, where long lines of passengers waited with their documents ready. The couple had always preferred keeping things low-key, a habit they'd maintained even after their success. Their investment firm had grown beyond their wildest dreams over the past decade, but they still believed in blending in, staying grounded, and treating everyone with the same respect they'd appreciated when they were just starting out. David paused to help an elderly gentleman who was struggling with his heavy suitcase, lifting it onto the weighing scale while Amanda held the man's cane. The small act of kindness was as natural as breathing to them. Success hadn't changed who they were at heart. As they approached the security area, Amanda spotted a coffee kiosk. "Want anything?" she asked David, already knowing his order by heart. He shook his head, still focused on coordinating with their pilot. The maintenance check was taking longer than expected, but neither of them minded. They'd learned long ago that flexibility was key to staying sane while traveling. The terminal's atmosphere was charged with that unique airport energy, a mixture of excitement, anticipation, and mild chaos. A child's laughter echoed from somewhere nearby, and the aroma of fresh coffee mingled with the subtle scent of leather from the duty-free shops. Morning sunlight continued to pour through the windows, turning ordinary travelers into silhouettes against the bright sky. Amanda watched a young couple saying goodbye near the security checkpoint, remembering how she and David used to travel separately in their firm's early days, chasing potential clients across different cities. Now they had the luxury of traveling together, though they still kept their old habits, carrying their own bags, waiting in lines when needed, and never making a fuss about who they were. David's phone buzzed again. "Jim says it'll be another 30 minutes, he reported, sliding the phone into his pocket. "Want to grab that coffee and find a quiet spot?" Before Amanda could answer, they noticed a commotion building near the premium security line. A well-dressed woman was gesturing animatedly at a young family, her voice carrying across the terminal. David and Amanda exchanged glances, both thinking the same thing: how unnecessary it was to add more stress to travel days. They were about to head toward the coffee kiosk when they realized they needed to pass through that same premium line to reach the private aviation wing. Amanda squeezed David's arm gently. "Maybe we should wait a few minutes," she suggested, but the morning was about to take an unexpected turn that neither of them could have anticipated. The regular morning at JFK was about to become anything but regular, as they would soon find themselves at the center of a situation that would remind everyone about the dangers of judging books by their covers. The coffee would have to wait, as would their peaceful morning routine, but what was about to unfold would become a story worth telling, not because of who they were, but because of how they chose to handle what came next. The premium security line at JFK was relatively short that morning, marked by its supple velvet ropes and dignified blue signs. As David and Amanda approached with their luggage cart, they could still hear fragments of the earlier commotion dying down. The well-dressed woman who had been berating the young family was now standing near the line's entrance, practically radiating self-importance as she adjusted her designer blazer. This was Rebecca Morton, though the Thompsons didn't know her name yet. She stood out even among the first-class passengers, with her perfectly styled blonde hair, crisp white blouse, and what appeared to be a brand-new leather briefcase. Her heels clicked against the airport floor as she shifted her weight, scanning each approaching passenger like a self-appointed gatekeeper. Amanda was just reaching for her phone to check the latest update from the private aviation wing when Rebecca's voice cut through the ambient airport noise. "Excuse me," she called out, her tone dripping with forced politeness. "I believe you're in the wrong line." David and Amanda exchanged quick glances, the kind married couples perfect over years of wordless communication. They'd encountered similar situations before, though usually more subtle than this. Amanda stepped forward to explain, but Rebecca wasn't interested in explanations. "This line," she announced, loud enough for nearby passengers to hear, "is for first-class and business travelers only." She punctuated her statement by flashing her own first-class ticket like a badge of authority. "The regular security line is over there." She pointed toward the longer line where economy passengers waited. A few travelers nearby began to look uncomfortable, some pretending to be absorbed in their phones while others openly watched the scene unfold. An elderly businessman shook his head disapprovingly, though it wasn't clear whether his disapproval was directed at Rebecca or the Thompsons. "Actually," David began in his characteristic calm voice, "we're heading to the private aviation." "Oh, please," Rebecca interrupted, rolling her eyes dramatically. "I fly through JFK twice a month. I know every trick people try to use to cut the line." She looked pointedly at Amanda's yoga pants and David's casual fleece. "The signs clearly state this is a premium line. You can't just walk in wearing that." A young man in line behind them shifted awkwardly, clearly wanting to say something but not wanting to get involved. A mother nearby pulled her curious child closer, whispering something about being polite. Amanda took a deep breath, maintaining her composure. Years of handling difficult business negotiations had taught her the value of staying calm in tense situations. "Ma'am, if you just let us explain." "I've already called for assistance," Rebecca announced triumphantly, waving over a TSA agent who was approaching with a questioning look. "These people are trying to access the premium line without proper documentation." The TSA agent, a middle-aged man with kind eyes and gray-speckled hair, approached professionally. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, looking between the three of them. "Yes," Rebecca jumped in before either David or Amanda could speak. "These people clearly don't belong in this line. Just look at how they're dressed. I'm trying to maintain some standards here. Do you know how much I paid for my first-class ticket?" The agent turned to David and Amanda. "May I see your documentation, please?" David reached for his phone again, where he kept their private aviation credentials. The morning sun caught his wedding ring as he moved, and Amanda noticed how his jaw was set just slightly, the only sign that the situation was testing his patience. Around them, the airport continued its usual symphony of announcements, rolling luggage, and distant conversations. A group of pilots walked past, their uniforms pristine and badges glinting. The irony of the moment wasn't lost on Amanda, how their attempt at a quiet morning had turned into an impromptu demonstration of why appearances can be deceiving. Rebecca stood watching with crossed arms and a satisfied smirk, clearly expecting the TSA agent to escort the Thompsons to the regular line. She had positioned herself like a victorious general, ready to witness what she surely thought would be a satisfying conclusion to her morning's good deed of maintaining airport order. Little did she know, the situation was about to take a turn that would wipe that smirk right off her face. The next few moments would teach her a lesson about assumptions that she wouldn't soon forget, though the way the Thompsons would handle it would surprise everyone, including Rebecca herself. The air felt charged with tension as David pulled up their credentials, but before he could show them to the TSA agent, a familiar voice called out from the direction of the private aviation wing. This voice would change the entire dynamic of the situation, though not in the way anyone might have expected. The morning's little drama was about to reach its turning point, and the lesson it would teach would resonate far beyond that premium security line at JFK. The morning light streaming through JFK's massive windows had taken on a different quality now, as if the sun itself was curious about the drama unfolding in the premium security line. A small crowd had gathered, trying to look busy with their phones while stealing glances at the scene. the smell of fresh coffee from a nearby kiosk mixed with the tension in the air. The TSA agent, whose name tag read Officer Wilson, maintained his professional demeanor as he waited for David to pull up their credentials. Rebecca stood nearby, tapping her expensive heel against the floor in an impatient rhythm that seemed to echo through the terminal. "I don't understand why this is taking so long," Rebecca announced to no one in particular, but loud enough for everyone to hear. "It's a simple matter of being in the right line. I see this all the time. People trying to sneak into premium areas they don't belong in." A younger TSA agent had joined Officer Wilson, drawn by the commotion. The two security officers exchanged quiet words, their expressions neutral but alert. Years of experience had taught them to handle such situations delicately. Just then, a group of travelers pushed past with their rolling suitcases, forcing Rebecca to step closer to the Thompsons. She wrinkled her nose slightly, as if their mere proximity might somehow diminish her first-class status. "I mean, really," she continued, gesturing at Amanda's messy bun and comfortable clothes, "there have to be some standards." An older woman in line behind them cleared her throat disapprovingly, though whether at Rebecca's behavior or the general disruption wasn't clear. Her husband squeezed her hand, silently urging her to stay out of it. They'd probably seen plenty of airport dramas in their time. Amanda stood quietly, her Harvard sweatshirt catching the morning light. She'd worn it through countless late nights building their company, through meetings with investors who'd initially dismissed them, through every step of their journey to success. Now it was witnessing another moment when appearances and reality didn't quite match up. "Ma'am," Officer Wilson addressed Rebecca, "please lower your voice. We're handling the situation." A businessman nearby had started recording discreetly on his phone, his tablet forgotten in his other hand. Two flight attendants paused their brisk walk to observe, whispering to each other behind practiced smiles. The scene was drawing more attention than the Thompsons had ever wanted. David's phone buzzed again, probably another update from their pilot about the maintenance check. He glanced at it briefly, then looked at Amanda with a slight smile. They'd built their success on staying calm in challenging situations, and this morning was just another test of that philosophy. "I've been flying first class for years," Rebecca pressed on, her voice carrying across the terminal despite Officer Wilson's request. "I know every type of scam people try to pull. Just look at them. They probably printed fake boarding passes or something." A child in a nearby seating area tugged at his mother's sleeve. "Why is that lady being mean?" he asked, loud enough for everyone to hear. The mother quickly shushed him, but the innocent question seemed to hang in the air, making several onlookers shift uncomfortably. The younger TSA agent stepped forward, speaking into his radio in hushed tones. The morning airport bustle continued around them, announcements echoing overhead, luggage wheels clicking against the floor, distant conversations creating a backdrop to their own little drama. Amanda noticed a familiar face approaching from the direction of the private aviation wing. It was Mark from their regular flight crew, his uniform crisp as always. He hadn't noticed them yet, focused on something on his tablet as he walked. Rebecca was still talking, her words tumbling out with increasing animation. "I bet they don't even have passports. Officer, you should really check their documentation thoroughly. I've seen all sorts of people trying to take advantage." She cut herself off mid-sentence as David calmly pulled up something on his phone. The screen displayed their private aviation credentials, along with their company details and flight information. Officer Wilson leaned in to examine it, his eyebrows rising slightly. The morning sun caught the screen's reflection, throwing a brief flash of light across Rebecca's face. It was about to illuminate more than just the terminal, as the truth of the situation was moments away from being revealed to everyone gathered around. Mark was getting closer now, his head starting to lift from his tablet. In just a few seconds, the entire dynamic of the situation would shift dramatically. The lesson about judging others was about to come full circle, though not in the way anyone, especially Rebecca, might have expected. The tension in the air was about to break, but how it would resolve was still unknown to the growing crowd of onlookers. One thing was certain. This morning at JFK would become a story worth telling, not because of private jets or premium access, but because of how people choose to handle the moments that test their character. The morning sun had fully risen now, flooding JFK's terminal with golden light that seemed to pause just before the pivotal moment. Mark Sullivan, head of private aviation services, finally looked up from his tablet. His eyes widened with recognition as he spotted the Thompsons in the middle of the growing crowd. Mr. and Mrs. Thompson, his voice carried clearly across the terminal. He quickened his pace, his polished shoes clicking against the floor. "I was just coming to find you about the maintenance check." The effect of his words was immediate. Rebecca's expression froze mid-lecture, her perfectly manicured hand still raised from her latest gesture. Officer Wilson's professional mask cracked slightly as understanding dawned in his eyes. "Your Gulfstream is almost ready," Mark continued, completely unaware of the drama he'd just walked into. "The navigation system check is complete. We just need 15 more minutes for the final paperwork." He reached them, slightly out of breath from his brisk walk. The crowd around them had gone surprisingly quiet. The businessman who'd been recording lowered his phone slowly, a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. The flight attendants could stop to watch exchange knowing looks. Rebecca's face had transformed into a fascinating display of emotions, disbelief, embarrassment, and realization, all fighting for dominance. Her designer briefcase suddenly seemed very heavy in her hand as she shifted her weight uncomfortably. "The maintenance team found a minor discrepancy in the system readings," Mark explained, pulling up details on his tablet. "Nothing serious, but you know how thorough our team likes to be with your aircraft." He glanced around, finally noticing the unusual gathering. "Is everything all right here?" Officer Wilson cleared his throat. "Yes, sir. We were just sorting out a misunderstanding." He turned to Rebecca, whose face had now settled on a deep shade of red. "Ma'am, I believe your concerns have been addressed." The older couple behind them weren't even trying to hide their amused smiles now. The little boy who'd questioned Rebecca's behavior earlier tugged at his mother's sleeve again. "Mommy, do they have their own plane?" He'd asked in that carrying whisper that only children seem to master. David slipped his phone back into his pocket, its screen still showing the private aviation credentials that now seemed almost unnecessary. Amanda adjusted her Harvard sweatshirt absently, a small movement that somehow emphasized the irony of the entire situation. I didn't," Rebecca stammered, her earlier confidence evaporating like morning dew. Her first-class ticket, which she'd been flashing so proudly, was crumpled slightly in her tight grip. A gentle chime sounded overhead, followed by a routine flight announcement. The normal airport sounds seemed to resume gradually, as if the terminal itself was coming out of a pause. Travelers who'd stopped to watch began moving again, though many were shaking their heads or hiding smiles. "Mr. and Mrs. Thompson," Mark continued, professional as ever, "would you like to head to the private wing now? We can have some fresh coffee brought in while you wait for the final checks." Amanda finally spoke, her voice carrying a warmth that surprised many of the onlookers. "That would be lovely, Mark. Thank you." She turned to Officer Wilson. "And thank you for handling this situation so professionally." The younger TSA agent, who'd been watching everything unfold, couldn't quite suppress his grin. Even Officer Wilson's serious expression had softened considerably. Rebecca took a small step backward, her heels no longer tapping their confident rhythm. The morning sun caught her designer blazer, but somehow it didn't shine quite as impressively as it had before. She opened her mouth as if to say something, then closed it again. David picked up their carry-on bag, ready to follow Mark. The crowd naturally parted to let them through, but there was no triumph in the Thompsons' bearing, just the same quiet dignity they'd shown throughout the confrontation. "Oh, and Ma'am?" Amanda paused, turning back to Rebecca. The gathered crowd held its breath, wondering what she might say to the woman who'd just spent the last 15 minutes trying to humiliate them. But the Thompsons hadn't built their success by tearing others down. Amanda's next words would demonstrate exactly why they'd achieved so much in life, and it had nothing to do with their private jet. The morning light in JFK's terminal had softened now, casting gentle shadows across the gathered faces as Amanda turned to address Rebecca. The crowd waited, phones still raised, expecting perhaps a moment of vindication or public shaming. What they witnessed instead would become a different kind of viral story altogether. "Everyone has rough mornings," Amanda said softly, her voice carrying just enough for those nearby to hear. "We've all made assumptions about others at some point. What matters is how we learn from those moments. She offered a genuine smile that somehow made her worn Harvard sweatshirt look more elegant than Rebecca's designer outfit. The sincerity in her voice seemed to break something in Rebecca's carefully maintained facade. Her shoulders slumped slightly, the proud posture giving way to genuine embarrassment. I'm so sorry, she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. I was completely out of line. David stepped forward, speaking for the first time since Mark's arrival. No harm done, he said warmly. Though maybe next time, strike up a conversation before making judgments. You might be surprised by the stories people have to share. The small crowd that had gathered began to disperse, but not before several people approached the Thompsons. A young woman in business attire stepped forward first, her phone still in her hand. I recorded what happened, she said, not to cause trouble, but because I was impressed by how you handled it. Would you mind if I shared it? People need to see this kind of response to prejudice. Amanda glanced at David, who nodded slightly. As long as you focus on the lesson learned, not the confrontation itself, Amanda replied. We could all use more stories about understanding and less about conflict. Officer Wilson, who had remained nearby, finally allowed himself a full smile. In 15 years working airport security, this is the first time I've seen something like this end so positively. He turned to address the remaining onlookers. All right, folks, let's keep the terminal clear. Everyone has flights to catch. Mark checked his tablet again. The plane will be ready in 10 minutes, he announced. Shall we head to the private wing? The coffee there is much better than in the main terminal anyway. As they prepared to leave, Rebecca made one last attempt to make amends. Please, she said, her voice steadier now. I need to properly apologize. I behaved horribly. I let my own insecurities and assumptions control my actions, and I couldn't have been more wrong. The Thompsons paused, and Amanda reached out to touch Rebecca's arm gently. We accept your apology. And hey, next time you're rushing to judge someone's appearance, remember this morning. Several of the remaining onlookers had their phones out, but they weren't recording anymore. They were looking up the Thompsons' investment firm. The older couple who had watched everything unfold approached them before they could leave. Our granddaughter is studying business, the gentleman said. She's going to love this story. It's not about the private jet or the fancy credentials. It's about treating people with dignity, no matter what you think you know about them. His wife nodded in agreement. You could have made her feel terrible. Everyone would have understood if you did. But you chose kindness instead. That's the real success story here. The terminal's usual buzz had resumed around them, but something had shifted in the atmosphere. The morning's drama had transformed into something unexpected, a moment of genuine human connection and learning. A group of high school students on a class trip had witnessed everything. Their teacher was already turning it into an impromptu lesson about prejudice and grace. See, she told them quietly. Success isn't just about what you earn or how you dress. It's about how you treat others, especially in difficult moments. As Mark began leading them toward the private aviation wing, Amanda noticed Rebecca taking out her phone, her hands shaking slightly. Later that day, a thoughtful post would appear on her social media, not mentioning the Thompsons by name, but reflecting deeply on the lessons learned about judging others based on appearances. The morning sun followed them through the terminal, touching everyone with the same warm light: first-class passengers, economy travelers, airport staff, and all. In its glow, designer clothes and worn sweatshirts looked remarkably similar, a detail that wasn't lost on anyone who had witnessed the morning's events. By late afternoon, the morning's events at JFK had taken on a life of their own. The video of the incident, carefully edited to protect Rebecca's identity while highlighting the Thompsons' graceful response, had started circulating on social media platforms. It wasn't the dramatic confrontation viewers expected. Instead, it was touching people's hearts in an entirely different way. In their private jet, now cruising at 40,000 feet, David and Amanda were surprised by the number of messages flooding their phones. Their company's PR team had called 3 times already, excited about the positive attention, but also respectful of the couple's usual preference for privacy. Look at this, Amanda said, showing David her screen. Someone had transcribed their words about learning from assumptions and posted them alongside the video. The comment section was filled with people sharing their own stories of being judged by appearances. A flight attendant brought them fresh coffee as they read through the responses. One comment particularly caught their attention. "I was having a terrible morning and was about to snap at someone who looked out of place at my workplace. Then I saw this video. I stepped back, took a breath, and started a conversation instead. Thank you for the reminder." Back at JFK, the story was spreading through the terminal like ripples in a pond. The coffee shop barista who had witnessed everything shared the tale with her customers, each retelling adding a fresh perspective on the importance of kindness. The morning's events had become a topic of conversation at gate waiting areas where strangers found themselves discussing their own experiences with prejudice and presumption. Officer Wilson, during his lunch break, found himself retelling the story to his colleagues in the break room. "You know what struck me most?" he said, stirring his coffee thoughtfully. "The way they turned what could have been a nasty viral moment into a teaching opportunity. No shouting, no public shaming, just pure class." The high school students who had witnessed everything were now back at their hotel, their social studies teacher incorporating the morning's events into their evening discussion about social dynamics and prejudice. "Remember what we saw today," she told them. "Success isn't measured by the clothes you wear or the way you travel. It's measured by how you treat others." In her office across town, Rebecca sat at her desk, barely focusing on her work. She had spent her lunch break writing a long email to her company's diversity and inclusion team, volunteering to share her experience as a learning moment. Her designer blazer hung on the back of her chair, somehow less important now than it had seemed that morning. The Thompsons investment firm was receiving calls from business schools, asking if David and Amanda would consider giving guest lectures about corporate culture and leadership. Their approach to the airport incident aligned perfectly with their company's long-standing values of humility and respect. A popular business podcast had already reached out, not to discuss their financial success, but to explore their philosophy about treating all people with dignity. The host was particularly interested in how they maintained their grounded perspective despite their success. By evening, several news outlets had picked up the story, focusing not on the confrontation but on the response to it. The headlines weren't sensational. "Airport incident becomes lesson in grace," and "How a morning mishap turned into a masterclass in leadership." The airport's customer service training department had already decided to incorporate the incident into their training materials. "This is exactly the kind of real-world example we need," the head trainer explained to her team. "It shows how assumptions can be harmful, but also how resolution doesn't have to be confrontational." Online, people were sharing their own "Don't judge a book by its cover" stories, creating a heartwarming thread of experiences that emphasized the importance of looking beyond appearances. The hashtag airport kindness was trending, filled with messages about choosing understanding over judgment. A business executive who had witnessed the scene wrote a LinkedIn post about it, focusing on how true leadership reveals itself in unexpected moments. "I've attended countless seminars on corporate leadership," he wrote, "but I learned more about genuine character in those few minutes at JFK than in any classroom." As the day drew to a close, the Thompsons' story had evolved into something bigger than a simple airport incident. It had become a reminder that in a world quick to judge and even quicker to condemn, there was still room for grace, understanding, and the kind of success that couldn't be measured by private jets or designer clothes. The sunset painted JFK's terminals in soft oranges and pinks, much like the sunrise that had witnessed the morning's events. Tomorrow, new travelers would pass through these same spaces, perhaps a little more mindful of their assumptions, a little more open to seeing beyond the surface. 1 month had passed since that memorable morning at JFK. The autumn air was crisp as David and Amanda walked through the same terminal, heading toward their regular flight. Amanda still wore her comfortable clothes. Today it was black leggings and an oversized sweater, while David had on his usual jeans and a soft flannel shirt. The changes from that day weren't obvious at first glance. The terminal looked the same, streams of travelers flowing through their daily routines. But small differences revealed themselves, like ripples spreading from a single stone dropped in still water. Near the premium security line, a new sign had been installed: "All travelers deserve respect. Thank you for your courtesy." It was small but noticeable, catching the morning light just as it had caught people's attention. The airport staff had embraced it as a gentle reminder of the lessons learned. Officer Wilson, spotting the Thompsons, gave them a warm wave. His team had implemented a new training program focused on handling situations involving assumptions and prejudice. You know, he told them as they passed, complaints about line disputes have dropped 30% since we started the new approach. The coffee shop where everything had started had put up a small chalkboard with daily quotes about kindness and understanding. Today's read, "Dress for comfort, pack your kindness." The barista winked as she handed them their usual order. She'd been there that morning and had shared the story countless times. Their story had evolved in unexpected ways. Instead of becoming another viral moment of public shaming, it had turned into a case study in several business schools about handling conflict with grace. The Thompsons had received hundreds of speaking invitations, but accepted only a few, choosing small business groups and student organizations where their message about humility and respect would have the most impact. Rebecca, who had seemed so formidable in her designer clothes that morning, had undergone her own transformation. She'd emailed the Thompsons a week after the incident, sharing how the experience had changed her perspective. Now she was leading a mentorship program at her company, helping young professionals understand that true success wasn't about appearances. The high school students who had witnessed everything had started a project at the school called Beyond First Impressions. They invited speakers from different walks of life to share their stories, teaching their peers about the dangers of judging others based on how they looked. As David and Amanda walked through the terminal, a young woman approached them hesitantly. "I'm sorry to bother you," she said, "but I saw the video from that day. I was starting my own business and feeling pressure to look the part, you know, expensive suits and fancy accessories. But your story helped me realize that authenticity matters more than appearances." The Thompsons' investment firm had seen changes too. Their client meetings, once held in formal conference rooms, now often took place in comfortable lounges where everyone felt more at ease being themselves. Their company had become known not just for its financial success, but for its culture of genuine respect and understanding. They passed a group of pilots chatting near their gate. One of them, recognizing the couple, smiled and nodded. The private aviation community had embraced the story too, using it to remind their high-end clients that wealth and status didn't define character. Mark from Private Aviation Services met them at the entrance to their hangar, casual as always. "You've started quite a movement," he said with a grin. "Last week, we had a client show up in sweatpants and a t-shirt. Said you'd inspired him to stop pretending to be someone he wasn't." The morning sun streamed through the hangar windows, much like it had that fateful day. Amanda adjusted her comfortable sweater, remembering how her Harvard sweatshirt had sparked such judgment. "You know what's funny?" she said to David as they boarded their plane. "That morning could have gone so differently." David took her hand, both of them thinking about the choices they'd made that day. Their pilot greeted them warmly. He'd been following the story's impact too. As they settled into their seats, Amanda's phone buzzed with a notification. Someone had just shared their story again, this time in a thread about moments that changed people's perspectives. The plane took off into the clear blue sky, leaving JFK behind. But the ripples from that morning continued to spread, touching lives in ways the Thompsons had never expected. Their success story wasn't about the private jet they flew in or the company they'd built. It was about staying true to themselves and showing others that real character shines through, no matter what you wear. As they reached cruising altitude, the flight attendant brought them their usual coffee. Below, countless travelers moved through JFK's terminals, perhaps a little more mindful now of judging others by their appearances. The morning sun caught the wing of their plane, throwing a bright reflection across the clouds, a reminder that sometimes the most important lessons come from the most unexpected moments.